This story takes place when I was 12 years old, and my brother Ryan was 10 years old. My brother and I had just came home from school, and we didn't live far from it, like a 2-minute walk from it actually. Usually after school I'd finish, I would grab my backpack and whatever I had for homework that night, put on my outdoor shoes and start making my way over to my brother's classroom, where he would wait patiently waiting for me to arrive so we could start walk home together. The walk home was the same as usual. When we walked home, we usually got home at 3 p.m., and as we got home, we each got a snack, something like a small bowl of chips or some cookies and milk, and we would sit at the table to eat. My mom was a hairdresser at the time who worked from home because when she had us, she wanted to be there for us and spend time with us since for a while. She was a single mother and we couldn't afford a babysitter and would usually finish work at around 4:30 to 5 p.m. most nights. Sometimes longer, sometimes earlier, depending on her day. My dad worked night shifts, so was usually asleep during the day, and then would be up for dinner. It was one of the days where my mom and dad were going to be going out to get groceries after my mom was finished with work. When the time came around, they got ready to go. Since this was going to be the first time my parents were going out for like a half an hour and leaving me to look after my brother, I felt very happy and felt like a big girl since I really wanted to prove that I could babysit Ryan. My dad had sat Ryan and reminded us what to do and what not to do. Don't open the door for anyone, we have a key and we'll come through the garage so it won't be us knocking, okay? If you need us for anything, call us right away. Do not wait until it's too late. We'll be gone for a maximum of a half an hour to get some quick groceries, etc. So, after we got told all the information we needed, they gave us hugs and kisses and left. Ryan and I went downstairs into the playroom. By the way, Ryan and I are very close because we had to go through a lot together and are close in age. We were playing with Lego at the time, trying to build something that Ryan had gotten for his birthday last year. Ryan told me that he would be back in a minute as he was just going to get a drink or some more Legos. I said okay and kept building and playing. About 5 minutes later, I don't know what it was, but I got a weird feeling. I immediately stopped playing and listened. I heard my brother speaking. I frowned in confusion. Why he would be calling my parents, and for what? I got up and started making my way up the stairs. I peeked around the wall that led up to the main floor where our front door, kitchen, and living room was. That's when my heart felt like it stopped, and my face turned pale. Ryan was speaking to somebody in the house. The front door was wide open, and a lady, like her late 50s or so, was standing in the doorway talking to him. She was actually taking her coat off and inching her way deeper into the house, asking my brother where my mom was and other things I can't remember. I ran up to him and asked him what he was doing. I pulled him by his wrist and he then got behind me. I couldn't get to the home phone that was in the kitchen because I didn't want to leave my brother unattended or leave that lady and not know where she was in our house. I couldn't get myself to talk to her. I was quite a shy kid, but I was frozen. I had no idea how to get this lady out of my house. But then I remembered my mom telling me one day, if someone asked where she was or where my dad was and wanted them, whether it was on the phone or in person, and they weren't home, to just tell them that they were taking a shower or something that indicated that they were in the house. So that's what I did. "Where's your mom?" the lady asked in a weird tone. I got a chill, and then worked up enough the courage to finally say, she's almost done in the shower. She'll be out in a few minutes." The lady stared at both Ryan and I for a moment and said, "Oh." She didn't finish whatever she was about to say because someone came in the back door of my house. I turned my head and saw my older sister come in after finishing at her job for the day. She noticed the lady in our house and ran up to us. I can't remember what she told her, other than threatening to call the police, but after that, the lady ended up leaving in a rush. I turned to Ryan and asked him why he would open the door, and he told me he had forgotten that my parents had a key and wouldn't be coming through that way, and he told me that the lady kinda looked like my mom through the window. When my parents returned, my sister had told them what had happened and that the lady left after she threatened her. My parents were a bit angry at the situation, but we're glad we were safe. It took them like almost a year to let us stay home alone again like that, but it was to make sure that the next time we did nothing like this would happen again. I don't know what the woman's intentions were, and I don't want to know what they were. My brother learned his lesson that day not to open the door to anyone when we were alone, ever again like that. So, to the lady in my house that day, let's not meet again.
Against the advice of my parents, I started working at a bikini coffee stand when I was 17 years old, and continued working there until I was 20. If you're unfamiliar with bikini coffee stands, they are little drive-through espresso stands, usually painted in some neon color, where all the employees wear lingerie or bikinis while they serve coffee. I know this sounds strange, and believe me, it is strange. However, the money was good, and it was fun at the time. Not to mention my parents really couldn't afford to pay for college. There is no loudspeaker where customers place their order. They simply drive up to the stand, order coffee, and make small talk as they oogle you in your skimpy ensemble. Within a matter of months, the boss gave me the busiest shift. The shift began at 4 AM and ended at 9:30 AM. Though the coffee stand was not officially open until 4:30. I had to count the till, grind the espresso beans, fill up the sinks, and take stocks, clean if needed, etc. The coffee stand was situated in the corner of a large parking lot, sharing the enormous empty lot with only one other retailer. This retailer didn't even open until around 10 AM, and so I arrived to the lot when it was completely dark, save for one dim street lamp above the stand, and the other in the far corner of the lot. I pulled up to the stand as I normally did, only this time it was my first shift alone. Normally I worked with one other girl, as the shift would get far too busy for one person. I had a routine with regular customers, as I literally worked every single day, as the boss wouldn't give time off unless requested. While I worked, I would see cars approach the stand, and know immediately which drink to prepare based on my recognition of a regular customer's vehicle. After almost a year on the morning shift, it was rare to see a new vehicle or meet a new customer. My boss was extremely strict about being fast and efficient, and would have us prepare drinks in advance for our regulars whilst they waited in the line of cars. My boss was so strict that for the first 6 months of my working there, he would watch constantly on his camera system and call me on the business phone to scream at me for lack of efficiency. After this, I became so fast at preparing drinks, I decided he guessed he would save money by having me work alone in the very early morning hours. So, like normal, I approached the stand and punched in the access code. I went inside and turned on some music right away to keep myself company. The street lamp directly above the coffee stand had burnt out a few days before, so it was rather dark outside. Coupled with the tinted sliding windows of the coffee stand and the knowledge that I was completely alone, I felt a little creeped out, though not nearly as creeped out and terrified as I would be in a few minutes. Even though the stand was technically open at 4:30, I wouldn't expect my first customer until about 4:45. I usually arrived at 4, but since it was my first shift alone, I came in at 3:30 to give myself enough time to complete all of the opening tasks. My first customer was always Dave. He drove a red sports car and ordered a double cappuccino heavy on the phone. He worked for the local Boeing plant and would brag about his high-ranking job in between awkward remarks about my body. You get used to that sort of thing after a while, but nothing could prepare me for this sort of thing that happened to me on that particular dark morning. Though many of our customers were pervy men like Dave, most of the early morning customers weren't as lecherous as one would expect. They simply needed coffee, and no other businesses were open as early as we. In fact, many of our morning customers were married women in soccer mum vans in desperate need of caffeine. I glanced up at the clock as I counted the money in the till. 3:50 a.m. I finished the count and walked from the back of the stand onto the main floor. There were 2 steps separating the back of the stand from the main floor. The back of the stand had no windows and contained a bathroom, large refrigerator, washer and dryer, etc. This is the area that my co-workers and myself would get ready and joke around where customers couldn't see us. As soon as we walked onto the main floor where customers could see us, uniform was required. Lingerie or bikini as well as heels. That morning I was wearing a matching pink lingerie set with knit stockings. The lingerie fully covered my breasts and buttocks and provided more coverage than a typical bikini that you would see at a beach. I counted all of the syrup bottles. I opened the fridge and took stock inside. I turned on the espresso grinder and robotically poured in a bag of espresso beans. I started filling up the large commercial sink with soapy water, and the music played softly on the stereo. Then I heard it over the noise of the faucet, coffee grinder and the music. I wasn't sure I heard anything at first, so I just ignored it. But then I heard it again. Someone was tapping on the sliding glass window of the stand. I wiped off my wet hands and grabbed my cell phone. 4:15. We weren't open for another 15 minutes. I checked the light switches to make sure I didn't accidentally flip on the open sign. Along with the open sign, the stand was equipped with bright floodlights to illuminate the presence of the stand. Due to the sheer darkness of the morning, I had contemplated turning the floodlights on when I first arrived, but was strictly forbidden from doing so until the stand was open. Without the floodlights on, and through the tinted glass, I could not see who was on the other side. I stood there staring at the window. Maybe it's just Dave, I rationalized to myself. I could hear my heart thumping in my ears. The tapping had definitely grown louder. I picked up the business phone and punched in my boss's number, as he had an extensive camera system complete with night vision, and could see in real time both inside and outside the stand. At the very least, he could tell me who was outside. The phone rang and no answer, so I flipped on the floodlights, walked over to the window, and saw the man, now illuminated by the bright lights. His head was pressed up against the glass, hands cupped around his eyes as he tried to see in. I jumped back. "Hi," he yelled through the glass. "Can I get some coffee?" "We aren't open for another 15 minutes, I'm afraid, and my boss will be mad if I open early." "Oh well, I can wait." The man then walked away from the window and stepped back into a small black Honda. I continued my opening duties, warily eyeing the black Honda. At the time I felt a false sense of security, lulled into the daily routine of my shift. However, this was different. At 4:30 I dutifully turned on the open sign and watched as the man in the black Honda drove up to the window. He was wearing a dark red baseball cap, a thermal shirt, and plaid pajama pants. I opened the sliding window. "Hi, sorry about that. What can I get for you this morning?" I said, trying to sound as normal as possible. The man looked at me for what felt like an eternity. "What I want doesn't appear to be on the menu," he said, not looking up from my crotch. "Okay, so I know what you're thinking. What did I expect working in this profession? Gentlemen?" I brushed his comment aside with a laugh. "We have a great white chocolate mocha." I looked around frantically. Where the hell was the usual morning guy Dave? I silently prayed another customer would pull up behind this guy. He looked away and stared at his steering wheel. "I want you to be my maid." "Excuse me?" I said, not sure if I heard him correctly. "I want you to be my maid. I want you to come over to my house wearing a maid costume with nothing underneath. I want to watch you, and if you don't clean correctly, I'm going to do whatever I want to you." He paused and gripped his steering wheel tightly. "I am not a nice guy." He looked up at me and smiled. Until that point in my life, I had never seen a truly sinister smile before. I slammed the long service window shut, ran to the back of the stand, hyperventilating at this point. I picked up the phone and called my boss repeatedly, with no answer, and I stood on the steps and peered out the window. The black Honda was gone, replaced with the familiar red of Dave's sports car. I never thought I would be happy to see pervy Dave, but here I was rushing to the service window to tell him what happened. I opened the window, all the while frantically relaying the story. Dave just laughed and muttered something about the guy dreaming. He told me I was being paranoid and the guy just had no filter. For some reason this put me at ease. Dave reached his hand out the window to place a $5 bill in my tip jar. He tipped this amount each morning. "Wow," he exclaimed, "you just opened and your tip jar is already full. I know you make coffee, but it's not that great." "Huh?" I said, slamming the register shut. The tip jar rested on the outside window ledge, so customers could reach it. I had made a habit of leaving it outside in between customers, as it could get very busy. I leaned over and looked into the metal canister. Inside the tip jar was a long white envelope that appeared to be stuffed into its capacity. My stomach turned, as I knew it would be from the guy in the black Honda. "Dave," I said cautiously, "it's from the guy I just told you about. I'm not opening that." Dave sipped his cappuccino and suddenly his goofy demeanor turned serious. "You're right. Let me open it. I have gloves." It was late fall and rather cold. Dave put on his gloves in a dramatic manner, laughed about my paranoia, and proceeded to step out of his car, and he took the envelope out of the tip jar and opened it. "Holy shit," he said, his eyes widening. He held up a stack of $20 bills held together by a rubber band. On the back of the stack was a folded up piece of paper. He unfolded the paper and began reading it. His eyes grew wilder. His hands were shaking ever so slightly. What does it say?" He simply said, "Get dressed and call the police." I snatched the note from him, his jaw slightly agape. The note was laden with spelling errors and looked like it had been written by a child. Oddly, there were rather long words that were attempted but spelt incorrectly. It said some very deranged things. There are some things too sick to mention here, but I will relay the basic message as best I can recall. Some things you just never forget, even if you want to. "You will come to my house. When you arrive, I will examine you thoroughly. And I will tie you to the post, and you will be punished for what you do. Every inch of your body will be bruised and sore. Afterwards, I will untie you and use you in every way possible." Just to mention, he used a different term, but it is extremely graphic and includes the word hogtied. "You can scream, but no one will hear you. This is your first payment. Upon reading this note and taking this money, you have agreed to follow through. If you do not follow through, you are stealing, and you will be punished more severely than if you cooperated to this initial agreement. You will clean every inch of my house. There will be no more mistakes, or more punishment will follow." I got dressed and called the police and my boss, who finally answered. The police arrived, and I went to the station to explain in detail what happened. I handed them the note along with the money for evidence. The female police officer nonchalantly told me I should probably quit my job, that this behavior was to be expected from their customers, and I told them that I had never experienced anything like this before. My boss reviewed the outside videotape footage, and the footage showed the man standing outside the coffee stand, just staring inside. Occasionally it showed him leaning his head into the glass and cupping his hands around his eyes for better view. It also showed him rubbing his crotch. Apparently he'd been standing outside since 3:40, 10 minutes after my initial arrival. At one point, it showed him going back into his car, to re-emerge several minutes later and finally tap on the window. I was shocked to realize that the man had watched me for almost a full hour without my knowledge. I felt stupid, but most of all scared. The footage also revealed that the man had his license plate covered with what appeared to be white paper. After reviewing the footage and the note, the police decided the man posed a potential threat, and that his behaviour was not normal. They sent an undercover cop back in the stand with me. I was shocked that they wanted me to go right back into work not even 2 hours after the incident. The cop sat outside in an SUV whilst I worked. The plan was this: if the man drove through again, I was to flick the open sign on and off to alert him of the man's presence. I worked serving all of my regular customers, trying my best to pretend nothing happened. I was told not to recall the incident to any one of my co-workers or customers that morning, in case they knew the man and warned him of police involvement. The man did not return that day, but he did return. Little did I know this would be the beginning of a year-long nightmare. The stalking continued for a while, roughly a year. The stalker left endless creepy gifts for me both at work and at my place of residence, all of which he signed off on as Turner. It got to the point where I couldn't prove it was him, because it would often be sent by a courier or a third party. He continued to come to the stand, and at one point he even promised to leave me alone. My co-worker was there, and we actually managed to have a very brief discussion in which he apologised and agreed that his behaviour was inappropriate. However, he resumed just days later. The police were of no help, and kept insisting that it would all go away if I just quit my job. I had his license plates, and he was out of state, and vehicle description, but apparently the car wasn't even registered. Despite taking a leave of absence, the stalking continued. I didn't want to quit my job, as this was shortly after the recession. My mum, a sole provider for a family of 5, had lost her job, so I wanted to chip in and help her so that we wouldn't lose the house. Other bikini stands in the area were not hiring, due to being embroiled in prostitution scandals, all of which were heavily covered by the national media. You have no idea how hard it was, and maybe still is, to get a normal job after having worked as a bikini barista. Employers don't like it on your history all that much. The few of the scariest experiences included being assaulted at an ice freezer outside the coffee stand. Thankfully he didn't physically harm me, just grabbed and touched me inappropriately. Turner coming through the drive-thru completely naked and jacking off in a pair of women's underwear. Another incident occurred when my friend gave me a joint a customer had left me on her shift. Crazy it may sound, my regulars often left joints in my tip bar instead of money, as I liked to smoke a lot at the time. I asked my co-worker the customer's name, but she didn't get a chance to ask for it. I was told by my friend/co-worker that he had long hair and looked like a hippie, and this fit the description of a customer who would regularly leave joints in my tip jar. I smoked the joint before I went to sleep one night, only to have a massive freak-out full of hallucinations and hysteria. I thought I saw ghosts, demons and fire, and I ended up in the hospital. I found out in the hospital that, in addition to having marijuana in my system, I also had a bunch of PCP. Later on, Turner would take credit for this joint by sending a text to my phone, letting me know that if I wanted him to smoke me out, that we could get together sometime. I guess he thought that this weed was enjoyable. Of course, I gave his number to the police. I feel like I gave them enough information to get this guy. But I was never taken seriously, or they had bigger fish to fry. They did find out, however, that the phone he used was a burner. In this period of time, it was evident that one of my co-workers was sharing my personal information with Turner in exchange for money, or maybe just because she didn't like me. This co-worker was later arrested on prostitution charges, and I ended up relocating and changing my last name, which is surprisingly easy to do. I did this primarily to get away from Turner, but also so that I could get a fresh start with new employment history, and get away from the negative energy that had encircled my life. I had taken nude photos of myself and my boyfriend at the time, and after we broke up, he had leaked them to everyone on my contacts list, including my co-workers, and of course, this meant Turner most likely got a hold of the photos as well. It may seem strange to you, but after a while the stalking becomes part of your life. It's kind of like living around a bunch of rattlesnakes. You may feel constantly on guard and on edge, But eventually, you work your daily routine around trying your best to avoid the snake so that you don't get bitten. When it happens, you do your best to move on. I've recently found out, within the last few months, that a man fitting my stalker's description was incarcerated some time ago for doing something even more frightening to another barista in the Pacific Northwest. There was also similar incidences and reports of a man driving through bikini stands naked, or with women's underwear. I suspect this man was most likely Turner. I cannot be sure it's the same person, as I never was able to find out this person's true first or last name, but I am hopeful that it's him, and that he will be locked away for a very long time.
About 5 years ago, I lived downtown in a major city in the US. I've always been a night person, so I would often find myself bored after my roommate, who was decidedly not a night person, went to sleep. To pass the time, I used to go for long walks and spend the time thinking. I spent 4 years like that, walking alone at night, and never once had a reason to feel afraid. I always used to joke with my roommate that even the drug dealers in the city were polite, but all of that changed in just a few minutes of one evening. It was a Wednesday, somewhere between 1 and 2 in the morning, and I was walking near a police-patrolled park quite a ways from my apartment. It was a quiet night, even for a weeknight, with very little traffic and almost no one on foot. The park, as it was most nights, was completely empty. I turned down a short side street in order to loop back to my apartment, when I first noticed him. At the far end of the street, on my side, was a silhouette of a man, dancing. It was a strange dance, similar to a waltz, but he finished each box with an odd forward stride. I guess you could say he was dance-walking, headed straight for me. Deciding he was probably drunk, I stepped as close as I could to the road to give him the majority of the sidewalk to pass me by. The closer he got, the more I realized how gracefully he moved. He was very tall and lanky, and wearing an old suit. He danced closer still, until I could make out his face. His eyes were open wide and wild, head tilted back slightly, looking off at the sky. His mouth was formed in a painfully wide cartoon of a smile. Between the eyes and the smile, I decided to cross the street before he danced any closer. I took my eyes off of him to cross the empty street. As I reached the other side, I glanced back, and then stopped, dead, in my tracks. He had stopped dancing, and was standing with one foot on the street, perfectly parallel to me. He was facing me, but looking skyward, smile still wide on his lips. I was completely and utterly unnerved by this. I started walking again, but kept my eyes on the man. He didn't move. Once I had put half a block between us, I turned away from him for a moment to watch the sidewalk in front of me. The street and sidewalk ahead of me were completely empty. Still unnerved, I looked back to where he had been standing, to find him gone. For the briefest of moments, I felt relieved, until I noticed him. He had crossed the street, and was now slightly crouched down. I couldn't tell for sure due to the distance and the shadows, but I was certain he was facing me. I had looked away from him for no more than 10 seconds, so it was clear that he had moved fast. I was so shocked that I stood there for some time, staring at him, and then he started moving towards me again. He took giant, exaggerated tiptoed steps, as if he were a cartoon character sneaking up on someone, except he was moving very, very fast. I'd like to say at this point that I ran away or pulled out my pepper spray or cell phone or anything at all. But I didn't. I just stood there, completely frozen, as the smiling man crept toward me. And then he stopped again, about a car length away, still smiling his smile, still looking to the sky. When I finally found my voice, I blurted out the first thing that came to my mind. What I meant to ask was, "What the fuck do you want?" in an angry, commanding tone. What came out was a whimper. What the fuck? Regardless of whether or not humans can smell fear, they certainly can hear it. I heard it in my own voice, and that only made me more afraid. But he didn't react to it at all. He just stood there, smiling. And then, after what felt like forever, he turned around, very slowly, and started walking away, just like that. Not wanting to turn my back on him again, I just watched him go, until he was far enough away to almost be out of sight. And then, I realized something. He wasn't moving away anymore, nor was he dancing. I watched in horror as the distant shape of him grew larger and larger. He was coming back my way, and this time, he was running. I ran too. I ran until I was off of the side road and back onto a better lit road with sparse traffic. Looking behind me then, he was nowhere to be found. The rest of the way home, I kept glancing over my shoulder, always expecting to see his stupid smile, but he was never there. I lived in that city for 6 months after that night, and I never went out for another walk. There was something about his face that always haunted me. He didn't look drunk. He didn't look high. He looked completely and utterly insane. And that's a very, very scary thing to see.
This happened a few years ago, probably when I was a freshman in high school. I'm not even sure if this really belongs here because I met this guy more than once and had a sort of relationship with him, but I will write it anyways. I was invited to go to this hangout place by a friend of mine at the time, and I decided to go. I didn't know it was a religious thing, and it was really cool until we were shoved in a dark room and preached to. We got to play games, shoot hoops, and interact with other kids, and I thought it was just supposed to be a thing for kids to do on boring Wednesday nights. I have nothing against Christianity, but I was not and am still not a Christian, so I was quite annoyed with having that information omitted when I was invited, but I still went to have fun. I didn't have much of a social life to begin with. I still don't, so it was nice to be around all these kids around my age from various schools nearby. This is where I first met them, I believe. Mark and Chris, both twin boys, absolutely identical. I seriously could not tell them apart, and that was a huge issue down the road. They wore identical clothes, had the same hairstyle, eye color, voices, mannerisms, etc. The only thing different was what came out of their mouths. Mark was a sweetheart. He loves flowers, animals, always smiling and friendly with everyone. Chris was the exact opposite. It seems stereotypical, a good twin and a bad twin, but it was true. Even though this happened quite a while ago, I still get nervous just thinking about this point in my life. Chris, for whatever reason, had his sights on me. He wanted to talk to me, wanted to sit by me. He wanted to talk to me, he wanted to sit by me, wanted to interact with me whenever he saw me. At first I liked the attention because no guy really paid any attention to me before. I wasn't exactly good looking. I looked very awkward and derpy, but was 11 to 12 years old, so it doesn't really count at that time. And I was a huge nerd. Teacher's pet sort of nerd. Did my work quietly, went overboard on assignments, that sort of thing. But Chris seemed to like that about me, and I liked his bad boy vibe, I guess. But then things started getting disturbing. He got angry very easily. If you so much as disagreed with him on something, he would threaten you, start saying things like he was going to hurt himself or break something. He carried around his own knife, which he used to cut himself, not because he was going to end his own life, but He liked the way the scars looked on his arms. He told me he likes to drink his own blood. He would talk about hurting people in horrible and graphic ways or torturing animals. He would gloat about murdering kittens by drowning them repeatedly or breaking their limbs and leaving them screaming in the woods. He was horrible, and I still feel very disturbed about it. It was at this point that I started getting scared. I thought he was just a bad boy that listened to Falling in Reverse and lamented about how life is meaningless, but just being a pretty decent guy. Boy, was I dead wrong. I felt trapped then because he went to my school, he knew my schedule, he knew where I lived, and there was absolutely nothing I could do about it. I tried not to anger him because I was afraid that I would get hurt, or worse, someone I cared about getting hurt. I think he knew this because it was around that point that he asked for my number, and I obliged. He started harassing me then, sending me explicit messages such as being in a locked room together, nude, with pills to make us feel certain ways. He asked for nudes. I didn't send him any, thank you, to pass to me. He demanded them. I still didn't send any. I politely asked him to stop, and he would threaten me. I still have this old phone due to a completely different reason, but I believe those messages are still there. I was terrified. I didn't know what to do. I eventually went to my mom, which was a huge waste of time because she's a narcissist and abusive, and eventually I will probably write some stories and are raised by narcissists about her and my dad. Like I expected, she dismissed it and went back to playing on her computer. I was too scared to go to a teacher or even the school counselor because they are pretty much all useless, especially the counselor. So I was stuck. My friend at the time thought it was hilarious and teased me about having a bad boy boyfriend. I became more quieter, took the long way to my classes, hid in the bathroom or behind people when I saw one of them, Mark or Chris. I didn't know who was who because when you can't tell them apart, they are both potentially the bad one. I was terrified Chris would impersonate Mark and trick me. I stopped going to after-school clubs. Chris got very angry. He couldn't find me. He knew I was avoiding him, and he got even more upset. He would send me threatening texts. I shut my phone off. I only ever saw him at the Wednesday night meetings. The final night I went there was the scariest. I felt his mood the moment he stepped through those doors, and it seemed like the atmosphere darkened when his eyes met mine. He gave me the most cynical smile that still gives me chills just remembering it, and he started towards me. I scooted closer to Mark and my friend. Chris somehow got a hold of my shoes and tossed them in the boys' bathroom. He told me to go get them. This is probably the point where I was thankful for having an abusive childhood because if I didn't learn that rabbit-like anxiety intuition, I most likely would have stepped into that single-stall room with an inside lock and gotten hurt or worse by him. Thankfully, I learned that I need to think through every single possible thing before I do something that may have huge impacts on my life. I'm a tiny female. I was the smallest in my class, and I am still tiny today. On campus, I pass as a child genius until I step into the math classroom, and I sometimes get free candy from the staff. Even though I am quick on my feet and can fight back pretty well, I can easily be overpowered due to my size, especially if it was by someone bigger, and Chris was a quite big guy. He was taller, more muscular, and physically stronger than I could ever be. I knew he had horrible intentions. I knew he had that knife tucked into his sleeve, and I knew he would follow behind me. I knew that he wanted to do things to me, and I knew that no one would hear or notice anything because it was so noisy from all the kids playing and talking, and no one pays attention to who goes into the bathrooms. Chris went off somewhere, probably hiding and watching me from a distance. I did the only thing I could think to do. I went to his brother Mark, and he saw I was shaking and on the verge of tears. I told him Chris stole my shoes and tossed them into the bathroom and asked if he could go get them for me. He understood. I never went back to the meeting place again. I saw those two a few times after that, but I avoided them because I didn't know who was who. At one point, Mark came up to me and tried talking to me, but I tried moving away. He became upset and started pleading with me, telling me that I'm the good twin. I apologized and said I didn't know for sure who he was. I've always wondered how many relationships his brother has ruined for him simply because they look alike. Chris saw me a few times. I remember him yelling at me, threatening me, and eventually just disappearing. He and Mark both disappeared. I think they ended up switching schools because Chris did something really awful. I don't know, but I still felt relief. I still have anxiety and paranoia about the entire thing, and I still wonder if Chris knows where I am or what I am doing, or if he plans on finding me eventually and coming after me to finish the job.
About 2 years ago, when I was a freshman in college, I decided to go out on a date with a guy that I'd met in my engineering class. He was about 6.5 feet tall and used to play football. His presence, accompanied by the fact that I was always used to living in a very safe neighborhood, made me confident enough to go out late at night. We went out to Olive Garden that night and had a great time. When we finished dinner, it was about midnight, and we had to take public transportation to get to the parking lot his car was parked at. He commuted to school and would always get his car in the evening. The area wasn't too bad, so I never really expected what came next. While on the train, we noticed that there were very few people. Not surprising, considering the hour. There was a questionable male sitting in the back of the last car, and a few casual others situated more throughout the front. Maybe 6 of us in the train in total. Paying no mind to the man in the background, James and I elected to sit in the front of the back car. Everything was perfectly fine until the strange man decided to approach us. Thankfully, I ended up on the window side while James took the aisle. But I will never forget what I saw. As someone who was blessed with financial prosperity my whole life, I'd never really seen up close what poverty and poor choices could do to someone. The strange man had layers upon layers of jackets and pants that sagged uncomfortably low. His face looked horrible. He had dark circles and gaunt features that made him look emaciated. His eyes were incredibly bloodshot and looked as if they'd pop out of his skull at any moment. And then there were his teeth, rotten and occasionally missing. I quickly turned away, not wanting to engage. He never said anything to us, thankfully. But he did march down the aisle and stop at a row of seats James and I were sitting at, only to rummage around in his pants. I'm not really sure what he was doing, and I don't think I want to know. Anyways, the man then returned to his seat in the back, seemingly uninterested at that point. My date and I were beginning to feel pretty uncomfortable, so we got up and decided to move to the front car, where the more normal people seemed to be. Apparently that wasn't okay, because the man immediately noticed us and followed us to the front. At this point, I was squeezing James's arm, silently warning him of what was happening. There wasn't much either of us could do, though, so we just sat with the other passengers and waited for our stop, which was at the end of the line. When the doors opened, James and I considered getting up, but all of us were frozen. The strange man refused to get off the train despite standing closest to the doors. Instead of leaving, he turned to all of us abruptly and came close to each of us, staring us dead in the eyes with an intensity that I can only describe as demonic. Minutes passed. It was as if he was looking for a sign of fear in each of us. When none of us budged and kept our cool, he finally exited the train. Everyone let out a sigh of relief and then hopped off. The man was nowhere in sight. What an odd guy, I thought. Thinking that everything was fine, James and I headed to his car, which happened to be at the back of the lot. We jogged because we didn't want to be out with that creep any longer than necessary. And that proved to be wise when the dude came out of nowhere, moments later, and decided to give chase. James and I then sprinted as fast as we could across the dark parking lot. And that would have been fine if I hadn't, you guessed it, tripped. To get to James's car in the most direct way possible, James and I had to hop over the cement areas with plants that separate the sections of the lot. As a tall guy with a huge stride, he had no problem. As a just over a 5-foot person in flip-flops, I managed. But I didn't expect there to be a stone block, those ones that stop you from driving too far forward, as well. My right foot landed on the stone block. I felt a sharp pain and fell to the ground, rolling a few times across the uneven, scratchy pavement. Fairly disoriented, I wobbled to my feet and called out to James, who was still sprinting ahead. Realizing I'd fallen behind and was injured, he rushed back and helped me jog to the car. And while all this was happening, the crazy guy was snapping at our heels. We somehow got to the car in time and locked the doors. I'm glad we did, because that deterred him enough to give up the chase. When I examined my injuries, it seemed that I'd sprained my ankle and ripped off multiple chunks of flesh from both of my knees. My lower legs were covered in blood, and I thought about going to the hospital, but I figured it wasn't life-threatening enough to do so. My parents had just retired, so my health coverage was all over the place. He drove me back to campus and helped me hobble to my dorm, where I went to the shower to address my wounds. I then took a couple Tylenol since I'm allergic to ibuprofen and proceeded to pick bits of rock and glass out of my knees with the manicure scissors and tweezers that I had available. Needless to say, I didn't get much sleep that night. In the morning, I went to the health center and got properly treated. I was in a wheelchair for quite a while after that and continued to bleed through my bandages even weeks later. So, creepy guy on the train who clearly was out of his mind, let's never meet again.